Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. On the 6th month of the Gaza War, skeptics are taking center stage in deliberations as to whether Israel can defeat the Islamist terror organization Hamas, whose October 7 massacre started the chain of events. The IDF is, of course, vastly superior to the now far less than 30,000 or so strong militia, which was structured in some 6 territorial brigades and 24 battalions. But the limits on the employment of Israeli combat power are becoming prohibitive due to international pressure mostly, with extensive foreign efforts seemingly trying to prevent Israel from achieving its war aims. Is this an accurate picture? And if so, can it still be changed? With us to discuss it, all the way from the United Kingdom in London, retired Colonel Joel Rayburn, who formerly served as a senior director of the National Security Council in Washington, D.C., and U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, amongst others, and now is, of course, the founding director of the American Center for Levant Studies. It's good to see you, Colonel. Also joining us from elsewhere here in Israel is Brigadier General in Reserve Yossi Kupil-Vasil, who formerly served as the IDF Intelligence Directorate's Research and Assessment Head, as well as the Director General of the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and currently is the Project Director on Middle East Developments at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Thank you for joining us as well, General.
Thank you for having me.
It's always good to have you indeed, and with me here in the studio, of course, our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, set the stage for us.
There is just a simple matter of defining what this war is. Does it only limit the discussion to Gaza, or do we have to speak about the Lebanese border, perhaps the Red Sea? And the other simple question of the relationship between the war aims and the achievements and the costs thereof. And each person can have a different view on this question. Supposedly tomorrow there is a ceasefire and the war is frozen, both in the south and in the north. And as both Prime Minister Netanyahu and Chief of Staff of the IDF, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, said on different occasions, in Gaza that would mean that 80% of the destruction of Hamas was achieved. Is it a good mark? Or are the elusive 20% going to frame the whole story as a failure? In other wars and campaigns, the cost in casualties was one measure by which the Israeli public, at least, examined the war. It doesn't seem this way now. Israel has lost 250 servicemen during the ground campaign, which started in late October. But because it started the war with some 1,200 or more killed by the Hamas, massacred actually, apparently this number of soldiers killed in battle is not as significant in the public's perception as it used to be. So we have to see whether we can really measure the war aims as set out by the cabinet initially, whether the timeline as the months go on is reasonable, and what happens if the war is stopped in a forcible manner by outside forces right now.
Well, for the sake of discussion, I think we should characterize the current war and ask the question, can we define this war as a war between Israel and the Islamist Hamas, or is this a war between Israel and the Western camp led by the United States versus the Islamic Republic of Iran and its proxies, with, of course, the derivatives thereof and the oversight of, potentially, Russia and China? General Kupil-Vasil, we'll start with you.
I think we are fighting two wars simultaneously. One is the war against Hamas, and the other is the wider war against the Iranian-led Axis. Of course, these wars are strongly interconnected, and the major arena in which we fight is Gaza, and what we are going to accomplish in Gaza is going to have a tremendous effect on the way the other war is being fought. And the war in Gaza is extremely important for us, but the other war is important for us as well. And it's important not only for us, it's important for the rest of the world. And our difficulty is to convey this message to the rest of the world because they focus on the war in Gaza. They are focused on making sure that the number of casualties among the Palestinian civilians is going to be as low as possible, and that the humanitarian problems are going to be saved and avoided. And they sort of miss the impact of something like that, for stopping the war in order to achieve that, and the wider war that is going to affect themselves. That's what we are trying to accomplish. And of course, Hamas is connected with the Iranian-led axis. It's part of that axis. Hamas, by the way, is also a part of the Muslim Brotherhood axis, and they are also challenging the values and the security of the West. And that's our mission, is to explain to those who are stubborn and do not want to understand it that, look, this war that we are fighting in Gaza is also a part of a wider war. I think the Prime Minister was trying to convey this message in his last appearances on the media. And it's not easy to deliver it because international community right now has other considerations to take into account, especially what matters is what the President of the United States is going to think about it. He is now immersed in an election campaign, and he is reluctant to accept it. I think the most important achievements we had right now is that following his last conversation on the phone with Prime Minister Netanyahu, he is ready to accept a delegation from Israel to explain why it is possible and important to complete the defeat of Hamas in Gaza and to enter Rafah unless Hamas decides to lay down their arms. And we should all hope that this task is going to be performed effectively and efficiently by the delegations that's going to visit the American capital in next week.
Thank you, General Kupil-Vasil. Colonel Rayburn, your take on the framework?
The answer to your first question of whether Israel can win this war against Hamas is yes, in my view, because Hamas is a force in the field. You can and the Israeli Defense Force can defeat Hamas as a military force in the field. And I think all things being equal, the conflict is on a trajectory toward that outcome. Now, as an aside, I don't understand the thinking in Washington about how that can be done without attacking the Hamas remnants that are underneath Rafah. But I'm not privy to internal intelligence information on that, so I'll wait and see what comes out of those discussions. But yes, Hamas can be defeated as a military force in the same way that ultimately, for example, in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was ultimately defeated as a force in the field, and it was forced to revert to just being sort of a clandestine terrorist network, sort of mafia network. I think that can be accomplished. I think what Israel has to confront now, though, is how to make that a sustainable outcome, so that once the military outcome is achieved, once a military victory over Hamas as a fighting force is achieved, how do you make that permanent so that they don't come back? So it's not just sweeping the water out and it flows right back in again into an ungoverned space. And I think so. There has to be a political and a governance component to the campaign as well, and that has yet to take full shape. I know there are a lot of ideas about that, but I think that's the undone work. But frankly, I don't see how either of those, either the military outcome or the political outcome, can be done without some sort of security operation in Rafah to get at the Hamas military remnants that are there. If they're left intact at the end of this operation, then they'll claim not just a military, they will claim a victory by having survived militarily, but they'll also claim a political victory. And that will have a lot of traction in the region in a dangerous way that will I think reinforce the Iranian regime's regional destabilizing strategy.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you, though, Mr. Oren, Baron Karl von Clausewitz highlighted, war is the extension of politics. And within that, also he highlighted the necessity to emphasize or characterize the policy necessary within the political sphere in order to know how to engage in war in the onset. And therefore, when we're looking at the various challenges and looking from that precipice, the disconnect between the policy perceived in Washington to that in Jerusalem vis-a-vis Iran, is that also trickling down to the conduct vis-a-vis the Hamas and Gaza in particular?
So to answer that, you have to go back to October the 6th. What was the Israeli policy ahead of the attack by Hamas? Netanyahu came to the United Nations just a few weeks, actually a few days before the attack, and said that the Palestinians are not going to have a veto over what is happening in the Middle East, the integration of Israel into the region, the coming normalization with Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. Within the Palestinian part of the Israeli policy, Netanyahu wanted Hamas to thrive as a counterbalance to the Palestinian Authority because he was against a Palestinian state as the end state of the process. And he believed, rightly or wrongly, that Hamas, as a rival to Fatah and to the Palestinian Authority, is good for Israel. This is what Hamas, among other aims, set out to disrupt.
The same policy adopted also by the government of Yair Lapid and the government of Bennett.
Which was just an interregnum between two Netanyahu.
No, but it indicates that there is a certain consensus on that matter at the time,
but it doesn't
7th.
matter. We can't go back. And obviously, Hamas did not attack during the Bennett-Lapid time, so we can't say that it was deterred or what other considerations it had. But once the attack took place, the first mission of the IDF was to repel the invaders. They had, for several days, to work very hard and very valiantly to kick them out, to kill them, capture them, or drive them out. Then started the question of what you just raised. What is the policy? What are we trying to achieve? And how do we go about it by military means? And sadly, if you look at it from a professional point of view, and we have General Kuperwasser and Colonel Rayburn, they are military experts. I'm not trying to compete with them. But if you look at the time wasted by Israel, regardless of the question of whether it was the cabinet or the military, too much time has been wasted. There has not been a lightning victory in Gaza, which would have enabled Israel to get diplomatic cover. There wasn't that humanitarian crisis at the time in October and November, and sympathy was on Israel's side because of the proximity to the massacre. And therefore, what we are seeing now in mid or late March is something else altogether than what could have been achieved 5 months ago.
General Kuperwasser, earlier today, Mr. Oren and I, also here at the studio, we discussed, among others, the fact that the general public and politicians don't seem too in tune with the statements made by astute and distinguished military experts and historians, such as Lord Andrew Roberts, for instance, and a few other experts from West Point, who come out and say that the IDF has showcased genuine professionalism, has managed to bring about results of avoiding collateral damage, of which no other Western military has managed to conduct its affairs in such a densely and complicated urban environment. And yet, at the same time, we're seeing that international pressure is rising extensively, detached from any official designations or characterizations of the true situations in Gaza. And I'm not diminishing the hardships that the civilian population is undergoing currently in the Gaza Strip. Nevertheless, when we're looking at the characterization put forward, for instance, by EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell, he highlighted that Israel was deliberately establishing famine when, in actual terms, that is far from the truth.
A couple of points. First of all, coming back to what Amir said, it's not true that the idea of the government in Israel was, regardless under Netanyahu or under anybody else, was to strengthen Hamas in order to compete with, to weaken the Palestinian Authority. That was just the opposite. The idea was to create a situation where Hamas would be strong enough in order to deter other groups of terror in the Gaza Strip and control them, and serve as an address in Gaza. Whereas at the same time, we strengthened the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank as well. It was not on the expense of the other. The decision of who's going to rule Gaza was taken by the Hamas itself back in 2007. They kicked out Fatah. It has nothing to do with us. And ever since then, nobody was interested in carrying out an operation that would kick them out from Gaza. I suggested to do something like that back in 2023 before the October attack. But nobody was listening to me because everybody was under the impression that Hamas was deterred. The wrong impression. So that's what the truth is. And we did develop an address, only a very problematic address, an address that was totally committed to killing the Jews and destroying Israel. That was the problem. Secondly, coming back to the assessment of the achievements of the Israeli military. Yes, it would have been nice if we could have done it within 3 weeks and take over Gaza. And maybe we could have, but we didn't. And I'm not sure we could. And we have to understand that taking over Gaza with everything that we know of today, even more than what we knew before we entered about the underground facilities and the infrastructure, it's going to take time. Now, there's a question mark whether we should have started with Rafah. And I think we should have started with Rafah, to make sure that all these sensitive issues that come up when you deal with Rafah will be dealt with before everybody forgets about October 7th. This was a mistake in my mind, but this is already behind us. It's water under the bridge. And we have to now make everything that we can in order to carry out the operation in Rafah in a way that would minimize civilian casualties and guarantee that Hamas loses effective control of Gaza. What we did until now is we took control of 80% of the territory and killed something or destroyed something like more than 50% of the manpower of Hamas. But we left Hamas with the ability to control almost all of the population. That is the problem. Now, some of the population is being taken care of, especially those who are in the Rafah area and in western Khan Younis. But some of the population, especially those who decided to stay in northern Gaza, they are suffering because it's difficult to reach them with humanitarian aid. And we see that Israel is now trying to come up with all kinds of innovative ideas of how this aid is going to reach these people living in the northern part of Gaza through the air and by sea and more routes that are being used for that purpose on the ground, just to appease the Americans and to make sure that the population is not suffering, is not coming to the stage of famine. And that's what we are trying to do. And this is supposed to develop the necessary support from the United States for carrying out the operation in Rafah. This is something we have to do. It's inevitable from our point of view because we need to win the war. And we need to do it as soon as possible because Amir is right. We are fighting against time. The time is running out on us. We have to do that as soon as possible. That's why the meetings next week in Washington are so critical. And regardless if we manage to convince the Americans or not, we shall have to do that. I hope we shall be able to convince the Americans. That's critical, as I said. But even if we don't, we shall have to do that. Now, I would just want to say one thing about winning a war against terrorism. I used to be the chief intelligence officer of Central Command, and before the second Intifada. And I remember in mid-2000, before the second Intifada, we knew the Intifada was coming. And I was sitting in the room that we used in the Central Command for thinking about how we are going to fight the second Intifada. And a group of 6 generals came into the room. I was sitting there alone, and they asked me, what are you doing? And I said, I'm planning how we are going to win the war against the Palestinian terrorism that's going to start in some time. So they said to me, why do you waste your time? No, don't you know that nobody can win a war against terror? I told them, listen, we have a commitment to win this war against terror. I believe this war is going to last 6 years, but we are going to eventually win it because we don't have any other option. And I think in this respect, this war in Gaza is similar. It's going to be long. All those who believe that this can be done within a very short period of time are telling themselves all kinds of nice stories that have nothing to do with reality. This is going to take time. We can and we will win the war against Hamas.
General Kupperwasser meant the IDF Central Command.
Indeed.
If there is any impression that he met with CENTCOM, this is not what he meant.
Which includes Central Israel, Judea, Samaria, the Jordan Valley, and more. Colonel Rayburn, I'd like to hear your take on this, since obviously we know it took roughly 9 months to eradicate the Islamic State in the Iraqi city of Mosul. And the last I checked, Operation Inherent Resolve is still operational in trying to ensure that the Islamic State does not rear its ugly head. And albeit all of those efforts by the superpower, the United States of America, and its allies and partners, both in the region, but also additional special operators from other allied countries, it seems like attacks persist. What can we learn from those challenges, and does the United States take its own challenges also into consideration when dealing with Israel, which is dealing with as complex issues as Mosul was?
Well, if I were the Israeli side, I wouldn't look at Mosul or the campaign against the Islamic State, that caliphate, as an analogy. I mean, look, the Israeli side, I think, has been use other campaigns in Gaza to compare with. Otherwise, I think it's apples and oranges, and I don't think it's useful to draw comparisons between what the U.S. did in either Afghanistan or Iraq and what is happening in Gaza now. It's very other than as a strategic communications exercise. I don't think that's useful either. I disagree. I think actually that the Israeli side is under time pressure from the White House, from the Biden administration, but I don't think really anyone else in America. It may be that global opinion and global diplomatic pressure, is on that's time pressure against Israel to wrap things up or to forego an operation in Rafah. But in the United States, I think the Biden administration's insistence on no Rafah operation and trying to push for what would actually be a military premature end to the campaign is out of step with popular opinion, and it's out of step with the sentiment of Congress. And so I don't think that a U.S. administration of any kind can go really very far out of the ambit of congressional will on this question or on the U.S.-Israel relationship. So I don't really think the clock is actually ticking down that quickly. And I think that if President Biden were to say, well, I'm going to suspend some sort of military assistance, or I'm going to suspend this or suspend that to Israel to try to get them to halt military operations or to allow the United States, the U.S. administration micromanage military operations, I don't see that there's a popular support in the United States or in Congress for that position. And so it's not really sustainable. And there would be a lot of congressional pressure and popular pressure against the administration for doing that. That's sort of my amateur political analysis of the Washington scene.
I appreciate that. We're drawing near to the end of the program, roughly 2 minutes left. Mr. Oren, what are we to expect in the near future? Are we to expect a certain alleviation of tensions, or is this only going to continue to mount?
Well, we've been speaking about Biden, but an earlier president, John F. Kennedy, once said, life is unfair. He was rich. He won the presidency relatively early in life, and then he was assassinated. So you can look at this unfairness from various angles. It's not fair to blame Israel for the way it conducts the campaign in Gaza. Obviously, other countries, let's say the Russians, would have killed 100,000 civilians rather than 10,000. But it's immaterial. Israel is judged by other standards, by a double standard, and it has to consider it, to factor it into its plans.
General Kupelwasser?
Well, I think that we are going to see two major developments in the coming days. The first is the ongoing discussions about the hostages. We haven't spoken about the hostages deal, but this is a major issue for Israel now. If there is a possibility to move forward, then we shall move forward on the hostages deal. And the other is the decision to move into Rafah. Now, they are deeply intertwined, and it's all going to be affected by what's going to happen in Washington. Yes, I agree with Colonel Rayburn that the time really is not that pressing. But we have to attend the timetable of the president. There are elections in the United States. He has to take that into account, and so do we, unfortunately. And we shall have to take that into consideration while we decide about the timing of operation in Rafah.
Colonel Rayburn?
Well, I think, look, the U.S. role, in my view, the U.S. role should not be to try to tactically micromanage operations in Gaza. It should be to do what the only thing that a superpower can do, which is to try to restore deterrence against the Iranian regime, which is the central brain of these conflicts on multiple fronts, and that hasn't been done yet. And I don't see any prospect. I don't see that the Biden administration is preparing to do that, and it's not even unleashing economic pressure, restoring economic pressure against the Iranian regime and the axis of resistance right now. I think I've said it 100 times on your show, but that's the big missing element. I would prefer that the U.S. administration focus on that level of work rather than trying to look over the IDF's shoulders in Gaza.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank General Kupelwasser, Colonel Rayburn, and Mr. Oren for taking out of your time to update us on the latest, and I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update, from here in Jerusalem, Shalom.